If we're gonna, all right, great. Well, for those of you who are joining a little late, my name is Christy Carr and I work for Tier 1 Performance, and we're here to talk with you about why employee mental health is healthy for business. We're getting some kinks worked out. Before we start, we'd like to get to know you a little bit more. So I'm gonna slide this over and hopefully you can see my new screen. If you can pull out your mobile device, tablet, or you can even do it on your web browser. But if you go to menti.com and you enter the code 382215, if you could let us know what organization or space you are representing, that would be great. Give you just a moment to enter. Okay, getting some diversity.
We've got more people joining us. I'm just admitting everyone from the waiting room.
Okay, that's fine. How many are we up to at this point? I have a lot of, I can't really see.
We've got 15 total participants, including ourselves.
Okay. That's great. So for those of you who are just joining, welcome. We are taking a poll. And if you can go to menti.com on any device really and enter 382215 and just let us know what area you represent, whether you're with the military or the government, non-military, industry, academia. Just wanted to get an idea of who we're talking with today. Jason, it looks like we've had a fair amount of people who answer this compared to who's really in the meeting. Let me know and I'll just move on.
All right. It looks like we've got a good mix of government, military, almost 50-50. And
all right.
Academia. Awesome. Thank you.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. And we just wanted to take an opportunity to know who is dialing, and you might be wondering who we are, which is a really great question. So Tier 1 Performance is a strategy activation organization, and we were founded in 2002. We have 8 locations, and I think what's really exciting is we're employee owned. We made the decision to do that a couple of years ago with over 200 experts in the field and a really nice bench of talent who partner with more than 300 clients. And here's just a little logo board to talk about some of our favorites. Our mission statement is improving organizations through the performance of people to build a better world. And we're really passionate about that last part, building a better world. And one of the areas that took us into was the area of mental health. My CEO, Greg Harmeyer, and Dustin Shell are going to be talking a little bit more about some specific programs that we have. But first, I would like to take a little bit of time to ask you a few more questions. So if you could keep your device out, we're going to go to the next question. So this is just a simple yes or no, but I feel knowledgeable about mental health, mental illness. Okay, thank you for the honesty. Definitely one of the reasons why we were excited to bring this topic is because there is a lot of information out there about certain sorts of things, but when it comes to mental health, maybe not a lot of information is getting out there. So thank you for answering. Looks like we have 8 yes and 3 no's. So we have 2 more questions. Here's the second one. Someone I care about was diagnosed with a mental health condition. Okay, I feel like we had 11 last time. So I'll just go ahead and chime in that I have someone and I myself have been. All right, next question. I would feel comfortable starting a conversation with a coworker about mental health. Okay, so for those of you who aren't very comfortable, never fear, we're here and we're gonna talk with you a little bit more about that. So I'm gonna slide this out. However you're feeling about mental health, whether you feel comfortable talking about it or not, whether you're just uncomfortable in general with the category, you're not alone. And I'm going to share just a couple of statistics with you. So 1 in 5 Americans are going to experience a mental health condition in their lifetime, and the World Health Organization puts that at 1 in 4 globally. We know that it takes about 11 years between the onset of symptoms and intervention. So there's 11 years in there that if we had more information, we could make progress sooner. For someone who is going to have a mental health condition that lasts a lifetime, a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, 50% start showing symptoms around age 14. And we know that 75% appear by age 24. And depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide. So there's this prevalence of depression that we have, but only half of Americans seek treatment for it in their lifetime. The other thing that we know, research shows us that if you have better intervention early on, you have better outcomes and results long term. So if we can get people talking about it, if we can get people to their doctors, if we can get the right resources to those folks earlier, they're going to go longer periods with mental wellness. So we have all of these things that are going on and all of these ways that we talk about it, and it really does leave us a little bit at odds. How do we talk about mental health? We still have leftover words like crazy and demented. Some people think panic disorder or psychopath. So there's not really that common language, and that leaves us with a bit of a stigma. So Tier 1, we decided to step into that space, lean in, and we wanted to learn more about things. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague and CEO, Greg Harmeyer, to talk a little bit about our journey. Greg?
Thanks, Christy, and thanks everyone for joining us. So about a little over 5 years ago, we started thinking about how Tier 1 can make a difference in some of the spaces that fit outside of our direct work. As Christy shared, our mission is to improve organizations' performance to build a better world. And we recognize we have a talent for communications and learning and helping people, and we wanted to apply it in a different way. And the 3 co-founders, including myself, had some conversations about personal experiences we were having in our families around mental health and mental illness, in that it just doesn't get talked about a lot, and there's not a lot of resources to support that. And so we decided to dive into this space, and we wanted to commit our resources to making a difference in this space, not knowing where to begin. And so we started by reaching out to some organizations, specifically Dr. Paul Keck, who's the head of the Leonard Center of Hope in Cincinnati, and said, how can we help? Where is there a need? And one of the things that Paul said to us was, look, I get calls all the time from CEOs and executives of organizations wanting us to help their organization because they've got nothing and they have so many issues, particularly at top levels in their organization, and they don't even know where to start. And so these organizations need help. And so we said, that's actually who we work with most. That would be a natural place for us. And if we're going to do that, we really need to start with ourselves. How can we make a difference in our own organization? And what would that look like? And so we started into this process without knowing anything. At this point in our history, besides the 3 of us, I had not had any conversation with a single employee about mental health or mental illness. And at that point, what was probably our first 12, 13 years in business. So we were stepping into what was, I think, a vulnerable situation, and something that we knew was very personal. And so we created in a very short time a month-long experience that we called Start the Conversation. And our whole goal was, how can we help people start conversations with others about mental health and mental illness and reduce the stigma that exists about dealing with it? And we began it with, day one, a video from myself talking about what we were trying to do, not knowing where it was going to go, and a survey asking people what they'd experienced. And some of the statistics here are some of the ones that jumped out at us most. If you back up a slide.
Sorry.
This idea that 93% of our organization said they were directly affected by mental illness in some way. That was stunning to us. Now in hindsight, it isn't as much because we've come to learn a lot along the way. But 45% personally dealt with it, which now we've come to know that 50% of people will deal with some kind of mental illness in their lifetime. So these are very consistent with the broader population, but we thought about ourselves as this high-performing organization with all these very successful consultants, professionals, had no idea that this was going to be such a prevalent thing for us. That began a journey where we engaged in dialogue across our company for a month-long experience that Dustin will share with you in a moment, and really transformed our organization. It transformed our culture, and it had a transformational effect on individuals. So if you do go to the next slide, at the final month of that, or final week of that month, we did some questions about how did this impact you? And these were just some of the statistics that stuck out to me. One was this: I talked to someone about mental illness for the very first time. 68% of people said that. So our investment in helping people understand this space and helping people get comfortable with it caused people to begin having conversations. And as Christy said, it takes 11 years before people start or first, have signs of mental illness and they actually get help. So some of these statistics get to the essence of what we think is super important, and that is helping shorten that cycle and getting people to get help.
Would you mind if I ask you a question?
Sure.
Or should we wait for questions till the end?
No, that's fine.
Why 11 years? What happens in those 11 years? Can we kind of peel back the onion and understand what happens in those 11 years?
I'll give you a quick thought on that, and I think it'll be a great part of the discussion in the backside of this. I think a huge part of it is a combination of lack of knowledge and understanding of what they're going through, and then the stigma of dealing with it, coupled with where to even go. And we've seen all phases of that. And by investing in creating this program, I think we've shortened all the cycles of that. If you switch to the next slide, and it's a great question, we'll come back to it. But these are some of the quotes that I've personally received since we did this program originally. And you can read them yourself, but some of what it stands out to, like the one in the lower corner dealing with their son's situation, it wasn't until I joined Tier 1 and took the mental health awareness assessment that I connected behaviors my son was exhibiting to mental illness. We hear a lot of that. Like, I didn't even really know, and I didn't know where to start, and I didn't feel empowered to do it. So a huge part of it is if you flip to the next slide, Christy, a few things that we learned that are critically important. One was when we started on this process, we did this out of more of a humanitarian thing. We wanted to help people. We never associated with the organization's performance. Now, after 5 or 6 years of helping multiple other companies with some of these journeys, creating other programs for high schools that Rod and Christy have been involved in, we've come to realize that there's nothing more important about organizational performance than dealing with mental health and mental illness. People show up with this every single day, and yet as organizations, we don't deal with it. So that's one key thing that I would leave people thinking about. The second is it has to get personal. And kind of back to your question about 11 years, the stigma, this idea that I might understand the concepts of mental health and mental illness and the science, but really knowing that there are people who can help me and that I'm perfect, that it's just a health problem. It's not a mental health problem, it's just a health problem. And the idea that there are people around me that I can talk to about it has to be part of the solution. And then the final thought that we've come to realize is, like, this is an iterative, continuous process. You can educate on stuff, but if you leave it there, you'll never get action and progress. And so when we flip to the next slide, we think about this as a framework of concepts that we deal with. There are 4 things that we end up building into our organization that we think any organization should be thinking about. And they go on a cycle. And they're the idea of educating and help people understand the space. There's also this idea of normalizing it and helping people understand that they're not alone and that this is a common occurrence to deal with mental health problems. Then creating support mechanisms for where to go. And then finally, getting the courage and encouraging them to continually deal with this. So this is a framework that we look at this work through. So I'm going to hand it to Dustin quickly, and Dustin's going to talk through some of the actual experience we created and the impact that had on people.
Yeah. So Greg mentioned our journey was called Start the Conversation. And a big part of that was as we partnered with Lindner Center of Hope and NAMI, this was 5 years ago when we did it, but it really came down to people not feeling safe enough to talk about it. And there's lots of research out there to show that a lot of people still lie about if they have to take a day off because they didn't feel like they could get out of bed that day. They still lie about why they didn't show up for work that day. And a lot of it comes down to we haven't normalized the conversation at work. And so that's a big part of where we started, was how do we start the conversation? So if you go to the next slide, take this into more of a personal, we like to think in journeys. If you think about that, the guy on the left there, we all come with both our genetics, our predispositions to having mental illness, and it is a genetic, things like addiction and depression and anxiety and OCD, those are all genetic conditions. But we also bring our past experiences that have shaped the way that we respond to moments. And so if you see that little gremlin guy right there, those are moments in time. When we have moments in our lives, we bring both our genetics and our past experiences to that moment, and they have either helped us to get through that moment and so for example, if you keep going to the right, some of us have learned to engage our support systems. Some of us have learned healthy mental health habits. We've engaged in physical well-being habits and spiritual and relational. We've engaged in the process of knowing how to talk and seek support. And so we're able to thrive through these moments. Others have not, and it's taken us down these darker paths where we've had to learn to cope and recover from some of the most common mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, OCD, and addictions. And most people don't know, and to your point about 14 years, they don't know because they don't know the signs and symptoms. So they'll live with it for 3 years before they realize it's a problem. But by then it's so ingrained. Now you've got habits. Now you've got habits that are prolonged that you have to work through. So part of our journey is, how do we make this personal and then create an experience where people aren't just talking about it and learning about it, but they have new tools to help them start doing something different. So if you go to the next slide, we structured our program in 4 weeks. So the first week is about just starting the conversation. Kind of what we're doing here. It's like, this is a big thing. It affects everybody. The second week was about mental wellness and like, hey, we're all on this journey. We're all on this journey, and our wellness practices, our healthy coping tools are the things that keep us in a place where when hard things happen, we can get through them in a healthy way. But then also week 3 is, hey, here are the top 3 mental health issues, and here are the signs and symptoms, and here's how you can start talking about it with your family to see how susceptible you are to them. And then the last one was around support. So what support exists within your organization, but also what does it look like to support others and seek support? And so, mental health is one of those things, it's hard to talk about. And so we had this choose your own adventure approach. Like, how do you make something like this stand out? And so we wanted someone to spend 5 minutes or 5 hours or just 5 days just seeping into this content or this experience. And so we had things like weekly emails that went out that kind of just gave a summary. We had what we called a guidebook that was this interactive playbook for how the journey went. We had weekly challenges and assessments that were aligned to that week's experience. You could opt into daily text messages that gave you kind of a bird's eye view or kind of personalize the content a little bit more. And then we had weekly panel conversations where we rose up new stories and we brought in experts to kind of help facilitate and normalize the conversation. And then on top of it, because remember, normalizing, educating, encouraging, those are all social things. And so we also had the option to choose a partner to chat with, which we got tons of really cool feedback that just having a person to talk each week with about these topics was huge. We use Yammer, and we also had a journal component to it.
Your order. Okay.
So if you go to the next slide, this just kind of gives you a couple more visuals to support the experience, but you can see the daily text there. The guidebook was an interactive mobile or on-screen experience, but it also would drive you to these different tools like the wellness assessment and self-care plan. If you go to the next slide, but there was also, remember back in the day when you get in person, in our lunchrooms, we would have weekly challenges and reflections on the lunchroom tables where people would gather around and talk. We had the Yammer group there, and you can see the infographic on the right. We printed it out so it became a physical piece for conversation. If you keep going, Christy, we're just going to kind of go through these pretty quickly, but I just think this is really important. when you're normalizing, you have to get leaders in your organization talking about this stuff so that it starts to say, you're not alone. And look, if this person can get through it, so can you. And so can you talk about it. And so we've got, these are all leaders in our organizations talking about what their journey with mental illness has been, what their journey with wellness and physical wellness and relational wellness has been. And we were doing these weekly panels, and you see Menti down there. So people were posting their questions, and we were real timing the conversation as an organization. We had about half of our organization tune in live. So it's about 100 people or so every week for a month tune in to these conversations. You go next to the next slide. And then each week kind of challenging them to do something different that week, especially as it related to where they're at in their journey. You can go to the next slide. So like, and then the last 2 weeks, we would bring in experts. So, you know, a counselor, a psychologist, and a psychiatrist to start educating them on, these are the people who help you, and here's what that journey looks like to seek support. And it was just really powerful for people to get some reactions, giving some actual screening tests and assessments. Yeah, keep going. That's great, Christy.
Sorry.
No, it's perfect. And then the last week was, most people, when we've done our research on this, most people don't even know the resources they have in their organization. So just giving a platform for conversation where you bring in all the different people who support their mental health within the organization and without, and get them talking about what access looks like. It was a really powerful thing for people to know, like, oh my gosh, it is accessible, and oh, I don't have to pay as much as I thought, or I didn't even know we had that. And then, and what's funny is all the United Healthcare, Horan, NAMI, they love giving time to support this, which is, if you're considering like, where do I start and what resources do I have? These resources are available. You just have to ask. If you go next, that kind of wraps up like the experience, and it kind of ends with this commitment, you know, and we don't push this stuff hard. It really is a matter of, hopefully if you've been engaged even just a tiny bit, even after this, you know, 12 minutes of hearing about it, you're already at a place where it's like, wow, just talking about it it could change somebody's life. And that's the process of normalizing this conversation. And so it kind of ends with that, and about sharing our stories are what kind of transform people's lives, and our ability to listen to theirs in return. And so that kind of leads us back into our framework here about educate, normalize, encourage, and support. And I'm not sure if we're going to break out into groups or stay in as a big group, but we thought this would be helpful for us to have a framework for talking about, you know, where are our organizations, and what are some things that we could be doing differently based on where we're at, because everybody's different and every organization has its strengths and opportunities to grow. So I'm going to turn over to, I think, Christy. Are you going to help us kind of get into these breakouts and have the discussion?
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Greg and Dustin. That was wonderful. So
Christy,
we
should stay together as a group.
Yes, I was just about to say that. So we had originally thought if there were a lot of people, we would do breakout groups, but it seems like we can stay together. And we prepared these 2 questions really to guide us along our journey, which would be, you know, where do you think your organization needs to focus, and who are the leaders or influencers that you can partner with to start the conversation? Since we're not having the breakout sessions, I think using these as a framework to begin sounds great, or you can just jump in if there's any questions that you have or anything that you would like for us to talk about more. That would be great. Totally opening it up. And if you wouldn't mind just letting us know your name, your organization that you work for, what part of the country you're in, that would be really nice.
Hi, Christy. I'm Kristen Christie. I'm in Colorado Springs.
Hi.
I'm 20. Hi. I love your last name, or your first name.
Thanks. I love your last name.
I'm in Colorado Springs. I'm the 2018 Air Force Spouse of the Year. My platform has been resiliency and suicide prevention. So I've been traveling a lot before COVID to a lot of installations talking about our family story of my first husband's suicide, and the aftermath with my children, and the hope that we have to come together as a community to where we can feel protected, respected, and connected. And this question number 2 that you have on there about the leaders and the influencers, that's what I have found has resonated with all of the installations. People have have suggested, not in a public forum because they don't feel very comfortable doing that, but if the senior leaders, whatever that looks like, at the squadron level, at the group level, at the wing level, would be more open to the conversation, starting the conversation on mental health and human resiliency and human superiority. We talk about air, space, and cyber superiority in the Air Force, and it all comes down to human superiority. But question number 2 that you had on there, if our senior leaders would be willing to go to behavioral health or mental health or get a vector check, you know, just changing the semantics, changing the wording on that.
Right.
We don't need a vector check, right?
Well,
I think it would, don't do as I say, but
right.
do as I do.
Right. And thank you so much. Well, first of all, I'm so sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing that. That's one of the reasons why we decided to go to Las Vegas and be part of the workshop. Were you in Vegas with us? Were you part of the?
Not.
Okay.
I was not. I was hoping to be there right now. Hopefully we can be there next year.
Right. I think sharing the story is so important. And then also, to your point, that was one of the reasons why we were we left committed to be in service to those who serve us. And we understand that organizationally, the way that we structure, it depends a lot on getting to the leadership, letting them understand and have empathy for the people that they're working with. And sometimes that means going into uncomfortable places and being vulnerable. But I think, I'd love to hear what Greg has to say in this space, but part of the solution that we put in has specific information and specific resources for leaders to help them become the example and sort of walk the walk that they want everyone else to walk, while walking along beside airmen and their families along the way. So thank you for the question. Greg, do you have anything that you would like to say?
Yeah, thanks. And thank you, Kristen. I just a few thoughts and observations. One, I echo, I think it's so critical that leaders lead with personal stories, whatever they are, because it normalizes everything. And it helps other leaders recognize like they're called to lead in these spaces too. How do you get there? I think sometimes is a challenge when people aren't already willing to step into this space. And I think, two things in that light, or maybe they're related, but I don't think leaders recognize how much people are showing up at work each day with so much of this that they're dealing with, whether it's a personal situation or someone they're supporting. And one of the things that was eye-opening to me is how, like I said, prior to 12 years, the 12 years prior to doing this, I never had conversations. Since then, I have at least one every month, and of someone dealing with something, and probably more than that. And what it's opened up to me is, A, how many am I not having? How many other things are going on, right? Because I don't expect people to come to me about it. And 2, how many, it just made me recognize, like, how much is going on that we don't know about? There's just so much, and because those were always there in the first 12 years, I just didn't know about them, right? And so how much mental energy and, and physical energy for that matter, people are spending dealing with this stuff. So recognizing the practical impact it's having on an organization, I think, is a really important thing to try to get leaders to understand. It's not just a good thing to support people, although that in itself should be sufficient. It is critical to the organization's health and success that supporting people more effectively be prioritized.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kristen, thank you so much for asking the question and sharing that. I would love to connect with you and get from you any information that you would be willing to share, because not only did we hear from leaders about some of these very things, but I think culturally, right? So how does one have a community where you can openly talk about mental health and wellness if the very act of going out and getting treatment or talking about it would impact your career, as I know that it does in the military, right? So I don't want to lose my gun. I don't want to lose my plane. All I want is a little bit of support and help to get me over this hiccup. So there's some things that are at odds. Would very much like to talk with you and continue the conversation.
We'd love it. We'll look forward to doing that.
That's great.
Kristen, I'll say hi as another. I don't have Pikes Peak in my background, but it's right over there. And I heard your talk at NCLS this year. So, and I shared that link with the team just now. So appreciate you
Thank
joining.
you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes.
I appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. Well,
Thanks.
Terrence, hopefully we can see each other in person.
That would be great.
Yeah, go out on Slack and send me a note, okay?
I heard that we're not pressing up against the time. We have a few extra minutes. So for anyone on the call who would like to ask a question or make a comment or share a story, please unmute yourself and we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I raised my hand, but we'll see. So my name is Sean Hoyer, I'm a partner with Blue Ruth Labs. I've been in the Air Force mental health space for about 16 years and a clinical social worker for 25. So one of the things that I might layer on to our approach and understanding is recognizing that mental health is not just an individual issue, but you've certainly identified it as having an organizational impact. But we would also like to explore the organizational dynamic that occurs. So certainly my work in several mental health clinics across the Air Force, I would see time and time again individuals presenting with work conflict with an underlying diagnosis of depression. So their environment had overwhelmed their ability to cope. So there's that intersection between nature, nurture, and kind of context.
Yes.
What we would find as we would kind of walk upstream to figure out who was throwing babies into the river was that the scheduling manager may also be experiencing mental health issues. And one of the nuances of mental health that might be even stronger than physical health is that it impacts your perception and your ability to do complex organizing and problem solving. So as you can imagine, an individual who's experiencing depression will find it very difficult to have empathy for their junior airmen and effectively schedule a 24/7 rotation of scheduling that prevents those 23 and 24-year-olds with new kids at home from working third shift over and over and over again. So you've got an impacted or impaired mid-level manager who is providing an additional environmental stress upon your organization. And those organizational norms and cultures say that those individuals that are impacted by organizational stressors should not take it personal, may not be able to speak up because they're trying to advocate to the person that just scheduled them, and they may be seen as a non-compliant complainer, rather than that senior leader of the squadron recognizing that mental health has impacted operational readiness at the individual level as well as the organizational level. So
Sean.
It was my job and privilege as a clinical social worker to not just intervene with the individual that was in the counseling room, but also reach out to that squadron commander to encourage coaching to that mid-level manager to have systemic change. So normalizing how mental health influences interpersonal and organizational dynamics might be another avenue.
Sean,
Wonderful.
I love your like systems view of the dynamic that goes on here, because you're right. We never work as an individual. It's always within the context of a team. And, you know, I think it's really hard too for that middle manager to, you know, how, first of all, the person who wants to raise their hand, how do they say like, my boss has got a mental health issue and that's the problem? That would never happen. And on the flip side, the middle manager, what would it take for him to realize the self-awareness of this is my problem? Because in his mind, it's somebody else's problem, or it's the pressures that he's feeling or whatever. It's a really tough space. It's a cool position you're in to be able to kind of bring light to that and interject it back into the system.
Yeah,
Thanks for
so
sharing
that involves kind of having a coordinated vertical approach to an organization, because the the coaching that you're doing to senior leadership about strategic messaging is more than just talking about the anecdotal, I've got a story, but it is looking at it from a mission readiness perspective. Until we at all layers of our organization look for this issue that is a systemic issue, again, your stats internally identify that 93% of your individuals have been impacted, but you haven't necessarily looked at it from a business case scenario, which a squadron commander might.
Yeah.
And say, we can tack on or pin that mental health is taking away from productivity and organizational effectiveness. And then it becomes a mission and readiness issue and allows us to normalize that issue and be able to attack it systemically.
Yeah. And what I love about what you brought up too is this idea, you know, so often we think, okay, if the individual just finds out that he or she has depression or anxiety and they choose to live differently, then everything goes on and it's sunshine and rainbows, right? And I'm here to tell you it's not, right? So you can empower an individual, but if the systems aren't there to support, or the person that the person is trying to make impact, and then there's also setbacks, right? So it has to have that more iterative approach. And then this goes back to what Greg was talking about, which is why we have to hit those 4 components, and we have to do so over and over and over again, because it's not a one and done situation at all. Thank you. Thank you. I think Blue Sky, were you in Vegas?
We were.
Yeah, you look familiar. And I think we met a colleague of yours earlier today. So very nice to make that. Very nice to make that connection. Great. Any other comments or questions out there before we move on? I'm sure we could get one more.
This is David Washington. Apologize about my camera, but I do have a question. We talk about the access. Sorry, I'm trying to. Let me back up. So, how do we address then the amount of resources for care? I mean, we talk about what we can do as supervisors and as individuals to do that, but I've seen many a case where everybody's done everything right. The supervisors try to make it available. The individual has tried to access, but they can't get in, or the availability of the care may be weeks or months away. How do you address that?
If you guys wouldn't mind chiming in, David, I think that was a very significant issue across multiple Air Force clinics. And what I was tasked to do in going across these various clinics was to help change the culture of how the provider clinics approached mental health care. Many were trained in individual services. That's your single 50-minute session. But what they were not up to speed on is that it is just as clinically relevant, and from a business case perspective, much more efficient to do group psychoeducation. So kind of going back to that model and providing the balance between education, support, and self-advocacy. So change how they deliver services at a mental health clinic can provide, in one case, it was an 800% increase in available appointment slots. And they moved their wait list from 2 days to 2.5 days. So it's really pushing the mental health clinic to change how they operate. Again, they've all been trained in how to do group psychotherapy, but they haven't necessarily bought into the system that that's the way that we can deliver services in the Air Force. Over.
Well, thank you for that information. I think that's really a nice perspective into that space. The military isn't the only place that's experiencing this. We're having very, very long wait times for just general civilians trying to get in. There's more demand than there is supply. So I'm very interested to hear that story. Thank you. We probably have time for one more question or comment. Anyone? Be sure to unmute.
All right.
Hey everyone, sorry about that. Jamie Megan here. I'm actually a British Air Force officer on exchange in the United States. So hopefully you can understand what I'm saying with my funny accent. So I'm really interested in what you guys are saying, and I really think it would resonate with some of the senior leadership. And I think it transverses, you know, nations. We're all having the same problem, and I've been doing a little bit of work with the UK and a bunch of stuff coming up on how we can seek alternative approaches. And I think that what's very apparent with some of the conversations we're having is one, I don't think that, and I've been on exchange in the US for 5 years now, I don't think our service personnel actually really know how to access the range of resources that they need. I think it's a little bit disconnected and incoherent, and I'd love to hear people's thoughts on the Prevents roadmap that's just been released out of the White House in terms of how to deal with suicide prevention and some of the initiatives going forward. But also, I'd like to, you know, really interested in people's views on alternative approaches. Culture, for me, is the main issue, the main blocker inside the United States Air Force right now. And changing that culture from within has to start from the top down. And until that culture shifts, I think you're going to see always that friction between mission demands, mission completion, and individual needs. But I think there's some alternatives, and looking at alternative approaches, you know, we're trialing some stuff in the UK using agro therapies to deal with PTSD and mental health. I'm an ambassador for an organization called Farmable that has veterans and military folk outside in the, you know, in the environment, undertaking basic skills such as, you know, growing, building, building wicker baskets, things like that, very hands-on type approaches. And then there's everything that stretches into the arts. And, you know, we've got people out there with various non-profits and charities doing things such as dance and ballet and theatre. And I do think that you guys have hit the nail on the head with regards to it being a personal journey, because I don't think it's one size fits all. And I do think we need to open up the aperture a little bit as you know, as a defense, military, whatever, and kind of seek alternatives. Because if we don't, we're really going to, I think, find ourselves going down a stovepipe in terms of the clinical path, when actually there may be some other things out there that suit others that we underestimate or don't know enough about. And I think there's a fear and reluctance within the organization from what I've seen, and it may be equally the same in the UK, to take some risk and maybe experiment with some things that are, you know, still in their infancy. So certainly interested in your concepts. We'd love your thoughts on sort of some of the cultural shifts and maybe some of the alternative approaches.
That's an excellent question, and thank you for sharing your insights. I'm going to open up to the team. Would anybody, Greg, Dustin, Rod, Terrence? I know they've heard a lot from me.
Just a quick thought, Jamie. And I appreciate you sharing all that, because I think your context is awesome. One, I think Sean getting at the idea around the business case of dealing with this stuff is very real. Like, you've got to help organizations understand the pragmatic impact of investing in this. It's not just a good thing to do; it's a critical thing to do to be effective. I think the limitation of accessibility for clinical help is real, and part of that's the economic mess that mental health has in the United States, particularly. It may not be as much so in the military, I don't know, but it is in general. There's just not enough people in the field, and it gets to the economics of it. But the kind of third comment I would make is some of it does get to, you know, I think, Sean, you pointed this out, and Jamie, you probably did as well, so the organizations, all of our organizations trigger a lot of the mental health issues. The stress and the workload causes a lot of the problem. And just simply recognizing that and dealing with that to reduce the amount of mental illness that we're triggering is something that we can do that gets beyond just clinicians being involved. So I think recognizing that fact and dealing with it up front and looking at you know, there is when somebody's sick, they need help, but there is ways to keep them from getting sick. And that's, I think, a way to look at it.
Greg, that's exactly where I was going to go to. It's like that full appreciation, because it's the system that we create itself. And, you know, you think about what's going on in healthcare right now, like there are some very real realities of having to staff people in these like really intense situations. But the way that they respond to that situation and the context they provide changes when you realize that like, it's not about the money, it's about the people that are doing the work. It starts to change the experience within that dynamic.
If I could just come back on one then. So in the life cycle then of educate, normalize, support and encourage, shouldn't we, and I had a conversation with somebody recently who's had some mental health issues and on the Army side, and effectively said something on the lines of, if we treated on entry somebody who is applying for the Army or the Air Force, if we did the same due diligence on the physical tests as we did on the mental tests, would we be able to move that line to the left and identify maybe some traits or triggers that could, in theory, be traceable further down the line, and do a better job of treating our mental health like we do our physical health in terms of, annual checkups and the like?
It's funny, but I think it's a cool idea. I think the biggest risk is starting the conversation without being willing to or knowing how to finish it is a risk. So hey, we can assess the fact that you're crazy, which by the way, we all are on that spectrum. But not having a leader caring enough to follow through and create a safe place for them to feel like their best self in the midst of it is almost doing more damage than asking the question in the first place. So I guess that's where my head goes. I don't know.
Yeah, the trick is to be able to normalize it without stigmatizing it.
Yes.
So, taking a look at, do you have teeth as opposed to do you have a bunch of cavities? So we've all got teeth and we need to provide some level of treatment and response. And the Air Force certainly then looks at teeth and your dental health along 4 classes. And only in class 4 are you precluded from deployment or mobilizing or PCSing. But they kind of assume that there's going to be a bell curve across those previous 3. And we need to kind of approach and normalize that we're going to go through phases in our life. Certainly, as your stats have shown, if your onset and your first kind of incident of mental health is occurring between age 14 and 25, then that is smack dab upon the age at which we're assessing our enrollment on our officers. As far as normalizing, Jamie, I'd probably shoot you back to the work of Outward Bound in the late 30s and early 40s in the UK, and the work of Kurt Hahn in trying to kind of shift culture for all of our merchant mariners and develop resiliency and grit, and how that then was inculcated into a culture. And what we found is, yes, you need kind of top level high line support, but the change needs to happen from the middle. Our senior leaders and our junior most employees are the ones that are most open to change, but our organizations build in a frozen middle so that we can have stability of the organization. And unfortunately, that's where we need to influence that culture. So there are some certainly anecdotal upsides that I can share with you offline.
Really quick, I just want to say to Jamie, I think the idea of having a conversation around mental health, just like we do a physical, is exactly one of the things that needs to begin to happen. We put in a proposal for AFWERX called Operation Live Well, and one of the key components of it is to bring a mental health wellness component, as well as social and economical or financial, as well as the physical. And the idea, if you can have going to the doctor become something that's normal, and going to see a therapist once a year as normal behaviors, getting into the habit, you start to reduce the stigma. If everybody has to go one time a year, just like a physical, then that allows people to start building a habit and rethinking things. So I do think that there's some potential there in having a conversation conversation around it, and would love to continue the conversation with you or any of you after this, because I'm getting pinged by Jason. We're at time. Thank you all so much for spending this time with us. We know you could be networking with anyone, anywhere in the world, but you chose us, and we are really touched. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for attending this workshop. Clearly, there's a lot of passion and a lot of care from this group. I have shared Christy's email in the chat, so please capture that if you want to reach out to her and the Tier 1 team. And thank you, Tier 1 Performance, for spending the time with us and for including so many of your members and sharing your thoughts and ideas and products and services with this group here. So we truly appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, be well.
Bye-bye.